Welcome, Wargamers. Doug here from 2 Plus Stuff, and today we are talking about potentially a new faction to be joining the Mortal Realms here, and that is the idea of the Chaos Dwarves. Now, they haven't officially existed in AOS. They were legends from Forge World back when they were used to support Warhammer Fantasy battles, but if I'm not mistaken, those legend war scrolls have gone away with the new edition. So all we're kind of left with is this vague abstract idea of the Chaos Dwarves. And so in this video, I wanted to talk about my thoughts for if they were to bring them back, what would we want that faction to be like? What lore threads would I expect to see if they became a faction in the Mortal Realms? What kind of questions they have to explain, for example, where have they been all this time, that kind of stuff. And also just get a sense for like, what could this look like reimagined in a different kind of fantasy that Warhammer Fantasy battles and Age of Sigmar are, right? They're different kinds. So let's teleport Chaos Dwarves to the New World. So for this example, let's pretend that sexiest man alive and man who beat the aging process, Phil Kelly, came into my room and was like, Doug, I need you to help me come up with Chaos Dwarf lore. Okay, we're going to start with the lore and then we'll get into the mechanics. What would I design them to be like? Well, dwarves, I might use those interchangeably in this video, are very interesting to me because they all have a central tree trunk that they all sprout out of. What we consider to be the Keratin Overlords, the Fire Slayers, the Dispossessed are all funneled from one origin as just dwarves. So I want to start with my faction, my dream Chaos Dwarves, with the idea of their story beginning at the same moment as all the others. So this is just one more sect of dwarves that did whatever it took to survive the Age of Chaos, but rather than going underground to the magma forges like Fire Slayers or up to the sky like Keratin Overlords or fleeing to Azir like the Dispossessed, these guys chose to embrace chaos in some way. And I'm actually pretty open to what that could be. So for example, it could be that they, like the Fire Slayers, barred the enemy at their gates and then slowly got corrupted somehow internally. So it's not like they were corrupted via fighting the enemy directly, but there was some internal struggle or temptation, something like that. I would be cool if, some of them found demonic artifacts and this helped them beat the Age of Chaos, so to speak, but corrupted them from the inside. I'm also okay with the idea of them just being mercenaries. So like, Fire Slayers can work for Chaos factions. They will accept coin from them, but it's always for the big mission of getting Urgold. That's what they want. But what if there were Dwarden who did that just as a means of survival and it became an everyday part of their business? Regardless of which of those, and it could be a spectrum because of course sub-factions can all have their own kind of mysterious origins in this game. But essentially what I want is their story to begin at the same time as everybody else's and then just choose, at least for the poster boy faction of our Chaos Dwarves, one of those pathways. Those initial decisions of there that then lead you to now. I think that's important because it places them firmly in the setting of being a Dwarden first and then a Chaos faction second, meaning the origins is what all of these Dwarden books have in common with their origin at the Age of Chaos and how they shattered into a bunch of different kind of, societies, different values, stuff like that. Starting there is important, but then let's ask the bigger question of where do we want to end up? So like, when I say Chaos Dwarves, what comes to your mind? And that's not a bad place to start because a lot of the faction's strengths, at least from fantasy battles, was just this idea of, first of all, the visuals. If you haven't seen it, it was released in Tamurkhans Horde, which was an old world campaign book. I actually did a full series on them. You can find that on the channel here. And it was a really cool supplement. It introduced the Chaos Dwarves very, very briefly. And essentially what happened in there is they would use suffering and pain and create almost demon engines for their technology. So it's not just an artillery cannon. It's a demon bound to an artillery cannon. We load it with shot, and then we kill a bunch of people in agony around it, and that infuses it with demonic power, and now it fires better. And so there's this idea, we have themes of suffering, fire, demonic infusion into technology, which is a thing that Games Workshop has always done very well. If you look at 40K, their Chaos Space Marine range has a ton of bio and mechanical fusions that should not be. So in the old world, you would generally have like chaff units who would go out and die first. Those are your slave races that are going to move and pull the actual cannon, so think grots. In Age of Sigmar, it's already been confirmed lore-wise that the hobgrots of the Cruel Boys are also often used by the Chaos Dwarves. So let's pretend for a moment that they have hobgrots or some variant. I'm sure they're going to have their own war scroll, but some iteration of that kind of diminutive creature at their disposal for chaff. Above them, I would imagine there's going to be actual Chaos Dwarves with rifles, who are probably going to function as your main troops. That's at least what the Forge World army had, was just a lot of heavily armored firing types of units. And tough shooting units are interesting because in the way that AOS functions now, it's interesting to have a unit that that's main output is shooting, but can also take a punch. We don't have a lot of that. It can't dish it out in melee necessarily, but you think about really, really great gun lines. Once they get engaged by cavalry, no matter how light or heavy it is, typically the effectiveness drops quite a bit. But what if your chaff goes forward and these meager flanking forces that your opponent can throw at you have to be enough to break through heavily armored shooting, your second line? And if they can't, that's a problem. They also had a bunch of crazy warp creatures, like they had bull centaur type things, which I feel like minotaurs now kind of exist more fully in Slaves to Darkness. But the idea being of like warped creatures that they have at their disposal, slave pits, that kind of thing. Something that almost kind of ventures into Molder territory, but not quite Skaven-y. It's more like the science version. We're doing experiments, right? It's very calm, calculated. I expect them to handle things like dwarves, which is they'll try to understand it all and then rationalize it to themselves. I expect to see themes like oaths and pacts that are iconic to dwarves, right? You put your name in the Book of Grudges, that's an oath to avenge somebody. You give your word on a contract, you fulfill it. I want the same thing, but for chaos. So like, instead of agreements between different factions to help them, now it's to destroy things. Now it's in service of dark gods. That same intensity and faithfulness to your choices and obligations and stuff like that, just magnified and turned towards evil. So that's kind of our general idea for Chaos Dwarves, right? My vision is we have an aesthetics and then how we got here. And really the one thing I want to highlight now is ways to make them fit into the range. So what I mean is visually, I would love to see these miniatures. Now we're moving from lore somewhat into miniatures. Have just different iconography that seems reminiscent of the Fire Slayer, specifically because they have a lot of those molten hot, themes and stuff with forges, that kind of thing. I want an inverted version of that when it comes to the models, but then I want their logic, right, their internal, how they think about things, to be borrowed from the Caradron, where it's more scientific, but they're using demonic alliances versus Ether Gold. Before the big purging of Warcry warbands, they did have the Horns of Hashut, which I believe were kind of knotted somewhat to be like the vanguard forces of the Chaos Dwarves. Hashut is a old world deity they brought forward lightly, and it's a giant bull head, which makes perfect, in terms of iconography sense for the Chaos Dwarves. I love that for them. But they got rid of that warband, and that was actually interesting because it was a warband consisting of different races. So there was definitely a dwarf. There was humans and I think one elf in there. I'm not quite sure. But that would be a very interesting narrative vanguard force. You send out everything you can't depend on as a dwarf. Would be literally anything that's not a dwarf. Can't trust it. We'll throw all them out to die. We have our chaff guys pulling the cannons, and once the cannons are in place, we could just throw them forward, whatever. And then the actual army itself of dwarves will come behind them. That is my amorphous idea for Chaos Dwarves. Let's talk a little bit about the history, how I would say that they got here. So my pitch is to say, again, starting back at the base of the tree trunk, when all Dwarden are dwarves in the Age of Myth, one megahold, okay, we'll call it that, just a huge city of dwarves, is besieged as the Age of Chaos begins. Now, the Fire Slayers fortified and survived. The Caradron went up into the sky. These guys, specifically, we'll call them the Hashuts, because I don't know what else to call them. There's no faction name at this point. Chaos Dwarves, I guess. They survived by being clever. So let's say that this mega city was being assaulted regularly by the Gloomspike Gits. Okay, just tons of little goblin guys running over the hills. Dwarves and goblins are a historical battle that goes forever back. But in the middle of those two fighting, a chaos army arrives and interrupts the entire thing. The numbers of our Dwarden city are kind of faltering as all of this attrition is hitting them. And so, seeing all these little goblins and gits hiding in the sides of looking for cover basically from these chaos armies, they wrestle them up and say, "You are going to help us." And so now we have dwarves with goblin slaves. Enough dwarfs are dead that we're going to force these goblins to move the cannons into place. That's enough. They can handle that. And then we'll fire them once they're in place. These dwarves learn that the bringing in of other types of species and armaments is only helping them survive more, and so they lean into that adaptability. During the course of these centuries that they are isolated and, evolving their culture, I want there to be some kind of demonic influence, whether it's like saturating them, tempting them from the inside out. I'm not quite sure. I need to workshop that. I do best with workshopping and brainstorming with a group. But essentially, in this cocoon of isolation that they are in, as they're incorporating Gits into, moving their weapons of war, I want there to start to be a tendency towards depravity. Meaning, they start to realize that the more cruel we are to the Gits, our weapons seem to fire better near them. Essentially, they start drawing the line between suffering and pain and efficiency with their technology. That's the line that I want to bring together for Chaos Dwarves. Because then you can have all kinds of great plot lines. You can have those original Chaos Dwarves be like, this is a matter of survival. It's not about, think of it in terms of science. It's not about suffering. It's about a transfer of energy, and we can kind of dehumanize and desensitize ourselves to these things. And all of a sudden you're doing horrific acts in the name of science. It's okay because you're a scientist. Conversely, it could also be a situation where a bunch of dwarves are trying to make the society better and they have a betrayer in their midst, which is kind of what happened when the Realm of Metal Chaman fell. There was a whole side story. I did a lore video about that one. But essentially there was a betrayal in the ranks and the whole realm fell apart. Eventually, their cruelty kind of matches the vibe of what's going on outside, and that demonic entity, presence force, whatever it is, who's been saturating them, essentially goes to the other chaos forces and inducts them into it, kind of as a median between the two. Now we have chaos forces able to work with these chaos dwarves. So just as the Keratin overlords are up in the sky building newer and better sky cities and dirigibles and all these kinds of crazy things, and the Fire Slayers are expanding their families, making new holds, that kind of stuff, birthing whole new species of magma droths. Now we have Chaos Dwarves who are, over the hundreds of years, learning to incorporate murder, suffering, torture, and pain and demonic power into their weapon craft. I would love it if there was a segment that was in the background of like, they've always been there in the background, but it took a long time for them to essentially percolate into the Chaos Dwarves that we know them now. But they've been surviving because Archaon's forces will come and they'll just be like huge caches of weapons and armor there. Essentially the demons whispering to the Chaos Dwarves, if you want to survive, make this stuff. And Archaon is essentially viewing it as tribute. I don't have to conquer this mega city of dwarves as long as you just participate in the war effort and don't make a fuss, which they aren't. This will change in my story with the Hour of Ruin. That is to say, the big uprising that just happened in the AOS lore where the Skaven did their big plan, blew up a whole bunch of Akshi. But more so than just Skaven, it really is a chapter of the main story where chaos is ascendant overall. So it's a perfect time for a new chaos faction to erupt. Now there's a few different reasons as to why the Hour of Ruin could be the instigating force to get the Chaos Dwarves out. Maybe it could be that this is Archaon calling up all reinforcements. So even the people who just hang out and make armor are being called to the front, all hands on deck. It could be something that simple. It could also simply be that whatever demonic presence is now organizing the Chaos Dwarves, I'm assuming Hashut, is going to push them like on maybe on a religious fervor or a scientific one to go out and explore the realms, conquer them. Maybe they're in a race with the Skaven. Like, dwarves hate Skaven and they hate goblins. That's just like the oldest Warhammer lore ever. So maybe seeing the Skaven in ascendancy, they're like, no. We can't be having that, because if they go get the choicest cuts, they're going to corrupt the entire land and it'll be useless to us. So that could certainly be a motivating force. We kind of saw something like that with the Dark Oath, where Gunnar Brand's tribe is in the mountains that got blown up, and he hates the Skaven more than he hates the forces of order. And I kind of liked that theme. I had mentioned that a few times, doing the same or similar thing with Chaos Dwarves of like, it's not so much that this threat is the biggest thing, it's that I refuse to live in a world where the Skaven are doing better than I am, which I kind of feel. But in the Hour of Ruin, while Archaon has the initiative, he doesn't want to lose it, and the best way that you can do that is to just keep steamrolling through your enemies. A lot of times, at least in Modern Warfare, that means siege equipment, artillery. And so I think that that could be the impetus. Whatever reason brings them out during the Hour of Ruin, what they bring to the table is what's needed by Archaon's forces at this moment, which for them, I think it's pretty easy to see is going to be weapons. I expect this to be the preeminent shooting chaos faction, and now we're going to start to pivot into gameplay. Till now, engineering in the context of chaos armies was really left to the clan's scryer of Skaven. That's really it. A lot of the other chaos stuff is very rickety at best. But it's important to note that even all the machinations of Scryer miss a lot of the technological themes that could be present in chaos, as far as army-wide things go. For example, efficiently motorized powered vehicles by steam and demons and all this kind of stuff. What if those are more reliable than the warpstone contraptions like the Doom Wheel? So we increase, shooting, decrease melee combat, but then stabilize movement values, that kind of stuff. I want to focus on artillery. Factories are spewing out enough munitions so that even the basic troop types are marching off to war with individual guns that are better than what an individual Skaven would have. Again, we talked about that heavily armored second line, while the chaff guys run forward and die. Unlike Scryer, these guys, the Chaos Dwarves, have the bravery, the fortitude, and the physical hardiness that the Skaven lack. And so they can create firing lanes and hold them. I want the artillery to be devastating, and I think that's the void that needs to be filled. It's the second age of chaos. It would help Archaon do better and ensure that no city stands before him. So the way that this will work essentially on a table is you have chaff as a resource, okay? And this is in my head. It's not an actual token resource or whatever, but you have to have chaff units. First, to act as, your barrier for your army, your more precious troops, the ones that are important, right? You need to have a front wall to absorb the attacks that are coming in from the enemy. But also, you also want to have them as a resource because the more that you sacrifice your own guys, the stronger your war machines get. So what if there was an army rule that was like, hey, maybe once per turn, pick an artillery thing we'll say the shooting phase, just to make it simple. Pick an artillery in the shooting phase, and then pick a unit next to them. If it's a Hobgrot unit, kill D3, and this thing gets +1 to damage for each one of those. Okay, so again, sacrificing dudes makes the cannon better. But what if there was also a second ability, or maybe even just a second paragraph in that one that says, if you then sacrifice a Dwarden unit, you get different bonuses. So the idea is the demons are feeding on different souls, and they are, as a reward, benefiting this weapon with different buffs. So what that means for you as a player is you need to balance the chaff up front who need to die to keep your important stuff safe, but you also have to have stuff in the back that you are burning the candle on a literal both ends, front line, back line, to keep the guns going, to push the army mid-table to then hold the objectives with your staunchly defensive, shooting gun line, and hoping that you can secure the objectives before your candle on both ends burns out. There's a lot of ideas within there as far as having more scientific ones that maybe reduce the randomness of some of the values you get when you're shooting. You could also have values that make your grots more numerous. Maybe there's a hero that allows them to come back as reinforcements when a unit's dead. I know Games Workshop tends to really like counters, like tokens. For example, noble deed points, blood tithe points, that kind of stuff. So I'm trying to think of a way of tokenizing that, but essentially that's the idea. Whether we want to call them pain points or whatever, sacrificing different kinds of units will lead to different kinds of benefits. The reason I like this, for a few reasons, it encourages army diversity. So if, like the Slaves to Darkness. I'm just looking at them off camera, so if I gesture that way, that's why. But we have, humans, we have minotaurs, we have all kinds of crazy demons that we can bring in if you're doing the Bellicor thing, but there's a menagerie of monsters that you can pull from. I expect if subjugation of other species like the Hobgrots and other monsters are going to be a part of the Chaos Dwarves, having an incentive to mix that army up sounds rad. What if there was a really slow unit? We'll take Minotaurs for an example, right? Let's say the Minotaurs, if you sacrifice one of them, I don't know, damage 6 on your weapon, okay? It's a big expensive unit. You're sacrificing one of them, but you get a really, really, really good gun, okay? Like a very good gun for one turn. That's important because if you burn all those up early game to have your really, really good gun turn 1 and 2, you do not have the Minotaur unit turn 3 and 4 when you're trying to move forward to secure those objectives. Again, you're burning the candle at both ends. And you can kind of balance the faction by which things you want players to burn up. So your lightest chaff, Hobgrots, will obviously offer the least amount of benefit, but they'll be the most numerous and easy to take. They probably won't last that long because they're going to die quick, but that's their job. Minotaurs, you might want them to actually last until turn 3 or 4, and if you sacrifice them on the way up the board, they're not there for you. That is my vision for the gameplay for this faction. I would love to hear your thoughts on it. So essentially, with the units that I just described, really the only ones that I've laid out there are Hobgrots, the basic troop type, which would be Chaos Dwarves in full plate armor with a rifle, shooting far better than Kharadron Overlords, for the love of God. And then a bunch of artillery pieces, different kinds of cannons that have different roles. And that's a strength of, I think, Age of Sigmar 4th edition, is the keywords and the universal special rules allow units to be really, really clear about what they do well, right? Anti-infantry, anti-cavalry, whatever it is. I want one that's really great at destroying terrain, specifically. Wouldn't that be awesome if, the way that you fought a Sylvaneth forest was to just burn the forest as the Sylvaneth player is trying to regrow it and add new ones to the table. So cannons that do different things based on their battlefield role, and I expect there to be a mix of cannon teams. What I'd really ideally love is very small teams that can kind of pull those bonuses in a lot of different directions, but Skaven just had the recent, is it 2 or 3 man teams that they had, where it's like an artillery piece that can be built a few different ways as a unit, like that kind of stuff. Weapon teams, that's what it is. I want it all to be very, very slow. But with them, also you have stuff like Caged Beast, Bull Monsters, Minotaurs. The Lamassu is a giant bearded bull with red curls that I absolutely adore. He needs to be in there. And what's great, kind of moving into the finishing section of this video, why I think this is cool, is that there's just so much potential, right? I listed out a very simple, rudimentary design idea for Chaos Dwarves. They have a resource, which is their own troops. They cannibalize that to get really good at the game, and the juxtaposition is achieving the victory point conditions of the game before you burn the candle out at both ends. I particularly love that style of play, especially if it's a very, very aggressive. And mixing that aggression with a movement 4 speed sounds fun. It really does. It's just a crazy duality that I enjoy. But narratively, I think this actually provides a lot of new, interesting room for Chaos Dwarves to be kind of explored, and Chaos as a whole to be explored in AOS. For example, the common theme that happens when Chaos armies invade a region is they'll win, but once fighting starts, after the prolonged battle, it all just divides and eats itself apart. But what if this is what made, this Chaos ascendancy different? Right? So hear me out. Imagine giant mobile forge factories, kind of like the giant crab monsters or the cog forts that have narratively existed in cities of Sigmar. But the point is, Chaos Dwarves act as a single, stable reinforcement point. And as the beast or the machine moves slowly, they consume everything in the area, eating up forest for wood, for the material, for war. All the minerals are being zapped from the earth, and these things are just going around basically harvesting the realms into the war effort for Archaon and acting as reinforcement points on the go. Imagine in Isengard from Lord of the Rings when they're tearing down the entire forest. That's what I'm talking about, but on the go. Underneath a giant crab walker. And so all these chaos-specific warbands who do not want to sit still and lord over a conquered land will basically follow these fortresses and use them for resupply and coordination. They act like an anchor for all of these smaller warbands that want to go off and fight until they implode. And it would make them thematically, I think, very different from other chaos armies. They would have a good head on their shoulders, be able to stay organized and stable and have endless war, but it moves at a slow and glacial pace. They're super useful for other forces, but again, their needs, their decisions, and their desires, because they're dwarves and better than everybody else, supersede everything around them. So they're going to move for Archaon's forces, but they're going to do it at their own pace and maybe deviate a few different directions if they see artifacts of power they like. They're going to do their own thing. This could also segue into a really simple regiment of Renowned to act as an ally force, which is just a contingent of Chaos Dwarves, maybe one line of gunners, some Hobgrots, and an artillery piece to add to the war effort to give some extra punching power. Again, in that scenario, this small little warband is going to cannibalize itself to keep that gun running, so it's up to the player to make sure the gun is allowed to stay running. Personally, I think this is really fun and exciting as a conceptual idea of an army. If it ever comes to fruition, I would love to see it. Like I said, we've seen lore bits alluding loosely to the Chaos Dwarves, and we've seen symbols on maps of like we haven't known before that kind of look Chaos Dwarfy. I don't know how else to say that. And so it's an idea, it's out there. So this is essentially just a discussion topic type video now that I have my voice back with the new year. I would love to know, if you are someone who owned Forge World Chaos Dwarves, what was your favorite part about playing them? And that could be from Old World or Age of Sigmar when they had their own war scrolls for a hot minute. Like, playstyle wise, what was it that you found engaging? Because that can be translated from edition to edition. And I'm curious. So let me know in the comments down below. Do you like my ideas? Would you play the faction as I laid it out for you right now? I would play the hell out of it. If they sent me a box right now, it would consume my entire life. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below and share this with someone who enjoys Chaos Dwarfs, particularly from the old world, because I would love to see them come back. I mean, at this point, I assume it's probably fair to say that they will, just because of all the whispers that they've put out there in various other lore formats, like the Hobgrots and side stories, maps, that kind of stuff. Like, I think it's fair to say it's going to happen-ish, but like, what form that takes is anybody's guess, and I would love to hear yours. So friends, let me know in the comments down below, what do you think of the Chaos Dwarves as I presented them, or you did, and we'll chat down there. Thank you so much for watching and listening. I'll catch you next time. Happy wargaming.